I sat in my car outside the clinic, engine idling, watching people walk in and out. Some looked tired, some looked scared. I just looked like I'd been doing this too long. The envelope on my passenger seat held a check for $873. Made out to Riverside Medical Center, the third one this month. I'd been divorced from Elaine for 6 years, but the bills kept coming, and I kept paying them. Not because I had to legally, the divorce had been clean, separate finances established clearly, but because she'd asked, and I'd said yes. Just until I get back on my feet, she'd said that first time. I can't manage this alone. That was 6 years ago. I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight, such a small thing to carry so much obligation. I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, nodding at the receptionist who knew my face better than my name. Another payment, another month of keeping Elaine afloat, another piece of myself I'd never get back. The marriage had ended quietly. No screaming, no thrown dishes, no dramatic last straw that snapped everything in half, just exhaustion. The slow, grinding kind that wears people down until there's nothing left but the mechanics of coexistence. Elaine had been sick for years. Chronic fatigue, mysterious symptoms that doctors could name but not cure. I'd been her caretaker, her advocate, her support system. And somewhere in all that supporting, I'd stopped being her husband. She'd been the one to say it first. "We're not married anymore, Harry. We're just managing." I'd wanted to argue, to say we could fix it, but looking at her tired face, I'd known she was right. We'd separated amicably. She'd kept the apartment. She needed stability, she'd said. I'd moved into a smaller place across town. We'd divided everything fairly except the thing that mattered most. The idea that we'd ever really been partners. The divorce papers had arrived on a Tuesday. I'd signed them on a Wednesday. By Thursday, the first medical bill had shown up at my door. I can't survive alone. Elaine had said it simply, without drama. Just a fact presented for consideration. We'd been divorced for 2 months. I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment when she'd called. The insurance changed. The coverage isn't the same. I have bills I can't pay. "What about your settlement?" I'd asked. "The money from..." "That's for living expenses, Harry. Rent, food, utilities. The medical costs are separate. They're enormous." They were. I knew because I'd seen them during our marriage. Treatments, specialists, tests that found nothing conclusive, but cost everything anyway. "I don't know what to do," she'd continued, her voice small and fragile. "I'm trying, but..." And there it was, the unspoken request. The space she'd left for me to fill. I'd filled it. "I'll help," I'd heard myself say. "Just until you figure things out." "Thank you," she'd whispered. "I knew you'd understand. You always understand." Love meant staying useful. That's what I'd told myself. Love meant not abandoning someone who needed you, even when they'd already let you go. The invoices never stopped. They arrived in my mailbox with regularity that felt almost aggressive. Blue envelopes from Riverside Medical, white ones from specialty clinics, manila folders from testing facilities. I'd set up a system, a dedicated folder in my file cabinet, a separate line in my budget spreadsheet labeled e-medical. At first, I'd thought it would be temporary. A few months of support while she stabilized, while she found new insurance, new resources, new ways to manage. But months became a year. A year became 2. And I kept paying. Because what else could I do? Let her drown in debt? Watch her health deteriorate because she couldn't afford treatment? Even after moving out? Even after signing papers that legally severed our connection? I couldn't sever my sense of responsibility. She'd call sometimes to thank me. Brief conversations that felt rehearsed. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Harry." And I'd say it was fine, that I was glad I could help. But lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, I'd wonder when temporary would end. I'd wonder when I'd be allowed to stop. Paul Henson asked the question over beers one evening. We'd known each other since college, the kind of friendship built on honesty neither of us appreciated until we needed it. "Why are you still doing this?" I'd been mid-sip, the question catching me off guard. "Doing what?" "Paying for Elaine. You've been divorced for what, 3 years now?" 4. 4 years, and you're still covering her medical bills?" I'd set down my beer carefully. "She needs help. She needed a husband. You're not that anymore. It's not about being married, it's about being decent." Paul had studied me with the careful attention of someone who'd watched me make the same mistake repeatedly. Decency has limits, Harry. You're not responsible for her life anymore. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still married, just without any of the benefits and all of the obligation. I'd wanted to argue, to explain that he didn't understand, that it was temporary, that Elaine was vulnerable, that I was just helping until she could manage on her own. But the words had felt hollow, even in my head. Deep down, beneath the justifications and the routines, I felt responsible for Elaine's survival. Not legally, not even logically, but in some fundamental way I couldn't quite articulate or escape. When we'd married, I'd made promises, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. And even though those vows had been officially dissolved, some part of me still honored them. Or maybe I just didn't know how to stop. Elaine had become part of my identity, the person I took care of, the obligation I fulfilled. Without that role, who was I? Just a man living alone in a small apartment, going to work, coming home, existing in the spaces between obligations. Paying her bills gave me purpose, made me feel necessary, made me feel like I mattered to someone, even if that someone had legally chosen not to be with me anymore. I knew it wasn't healthy. Paul had said as much, my sister had hinted at it. Even my therapist, the one I'd seen briefly after the divorce, had suggested I was prolonging attachment through caretaking. But knowing something and changing it are different things. So I kept paying, kept answering her calls, kept being the person she could count on. Because if I stopped, what would be left? Years passed with the quiet accumulation of small sacrifices. My apartment stayed modest. One bedroom, minimal furniture, nothing that required maintenance or attention. I told myself it was practical, efficient, but really it was just easier not to invest in a life that felt temporary. Meanwhile, Elaine's treatments grew more expensive. New specialists, advanced therapies, medications with names I couldn't pronounce, and costs I could barely afford. The e-medical line in my budget expanded from a minor expense to a major commitment. Some months, it was more than my rent. I'd cut back on other things to compensate. No vacations. No new car when my old one started making concerning noises. Dinner out became a luxury I scheduled and budgeted for, rather than something spontaneous. Paul had stopped asking why I was doing it. He'd just watch me with a mixture of pity and frustration that made me avoid him more than I should have. My life had become a holding pattern. Not moving forward, not quite standing still. Just maintaining, surviving, paying. And somewhere in all that maintenance, I'd forgotten what I was maintaining it for. Every payment came with the same message from Elaine. A text, usually. Brief and grateful. Thank you. I couldn't do this without you. 7 words that carried the weight of our entire post-marriage relationship. At first, those messages had felt validating, proof that I was making a difference, that my sacrifice mattered, that someone needed me. But after years of the same 7 words, they'd started to feel mechanical. A required acknowledgement rather than genuine gratitude. I'd saved them all in a folder on my phone, hundreds of identical messages spanning years, a digital record of appreciation that somehow felt emptier the more it accumulated. Sometimes I'd scroll through them late at night, trying to remember when "thank you" had stopped feeling like connection and started feeling like transaction. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, just that somewhere between the first message and the 500th, something essential had shifted. She needed me. I knew that. The bills proved it. The treatments required it. But did she want me? Did she think about me beyond my utility? I didn't know, and increasingly I was afraid to find out. I avoided relationships because Elaine's emergencies always came first. A coworker had asked me out once, Maggie from accounting. She was kind, funny, made me laugh during lunch breaks. I'd almost said yes. The word had been forming when my phone had buzzed. Elaine. Medical emergency. Could I come to the clinic? I'm sorry, I told Maggie. I have to take this. I'd left work early, driven to Riverside, spent 3 hours in a waiting room while Elaine had tests run for a symptom I'd learned to recognize as chronic but not critical. When I'd gotten home that night, Maggie had already left me a message. Maybe another time. There hadn't been another time. She'd started dating someone from sales 2 months later. Someone available. Someone whose phone didn't buzz with other obligations. I'd told myself it was fine, that I wasn't ready anyway, that focusing on myself would be selfish when Elaine needed support. But watching Maggie laugh with her new boyfriend in the break room, I'd felt something shift. Not jealousy exactly, just the quiet recognition that I'd chosen this isolation, that every time I prioritized Elaine's emergencies, I was deprioritizing my own life, and I didn't know how to stop. When I asked about recovery, Elaine's answers were always vague but urgent. "How are you feeling?" I'd ask during our brief check-in calls. Better some days, worse others. "What do the doctors say? They're trying new treatments. It takes time." "How much time?" A pause. Then, "I don't know, Harry. I wish I did, but these things don't follow schedules." The conversations followed a pattern. My questions seeking clarity. Her answers providing just enough information to justify continued support, but never enough to suggest an endpoint. I'd learned not to press. When I did, she'd get defensive or tearful, and I'd feel guilty for questioning someone who was suffering. "I'm doing my best," she'd say, voice fragile. "I know this is hard on you too." And I'd backtrack, reassure her, tell her I wasn't complaining, just trying to understand. But understanding never came. Just more bills, more treatments, more vague updates about conditions that plateaued but never quite resolved. The goalpost of temporary kept moving, and I kept following it, too afraid to ask when we'd finally arrive. The clinic staff greeted me by name before asking about Elaine. "Mr. Wood, good to see you." The receptionist would smile, already pulling up the account. "Here for Mrs. Wood's balance?" Not my wife anymore, but the correction felt too complicated to make every time. I'd just nod, hand over the check, sign the receipt. Sometimes Martha Keel would emerge from the back office, friendly and efficient. "Harry, you're keeping us in business," she'd joke. I'd force a smile. Make small talk about weather or traffic, anything to avoid the reality that I'd become a regular at my ex-wife's medical facility. They knew me better than most people in my actual life. Knew my payment schedule, knew which insurance codes applied to which procedures, knew that I'd always pay in full rather than set up a payment plan. "You're very generous," Martha had said once. Not many ex-husbands would do this. I'd shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just trying to help." "Well, Elaine's lucky to have you." Was she, or was I just convenient? A reliable funding source who'd never learned to say no. I didn't ask, just took my receipt and left. I realized one day that I knew every line item on Elaine's medical bills, but nothing about her daily life. I could recite the costs of her medications, name her specialists, explain the difference between her various treatment protocols. But I couldn't tell you what she did on weekends, who her friends were, what she watched on TV. Whether she was happy. We'd become a transaction. I paid. She thanked me. That was the extent of our interaction. Sometimes I'd wonder what she'd say if I asked personal questions, if I tried to reconnect as people rather than as creditor and debtor. But I never did, because maintaining distance felt safer than risking rejection. Easier to be useful than to be unwanted. One evening, staring at another invoice, I'd had a strange thought. What if this arrangement suited her perfectly? What if she preferred me at arm's length, financially supportive but emotionally absent? What if I'd been convenient all along, first as a husband, now as a benefactor, and she'd simply adapted her needs to match whatever I was willing to provide? The thought had unsettled me so deeply I'd pushed it away. But it lingered, quiet, persistent, impossible to completely ignore. Martha Keel asked me a question one afternoon that changed everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. I'd come to pay as usual. She'd been processing the payment, typing information into her computer with practiced efficiency. "So how's Elaine adjusting to the new plan?" she'd asked casually. I'd looked up from signing the receipt. "New plan?" Martha had paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her expression shifted, just slightly, from friendly to careful. The coverage change," she'd said slowly. "From the individual policy to the employer plan?" "I don't know anything about an employer plan." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that arrives when someone realizes they've said something they shouldn't have. "Oh," Martha had looked down at her screen. I shouldn't have assumed you'd know. Privacy and all that." "What employer plan?" I'd asked again, keeping my voice steady. "I really can't discuss patient details without authorization," she'd said, professional now where she'd been friendly a moment before. I apologize for the confusion. She'd handed me the receipt, avoiding eye contact. I'd left with a strange tightness in my chest, not quite alarm. Just awareness. Something had been said. Something Martha had assumed I already knew. Something about Elaine that apparently I didn't. Martha had mentioned an insurance change, then stopped herself. The phrase replayed in my head for days, adjusting to the new plan, from individual policy to employer plan. Employer plan meant employment. Stable employment with benefits. Elaine had been on disability when we'd divorced. Her condition had made working impossible, she'd said. That's why she needed my help. No income, limited insurance, mountains of medical debt. But if she had employer coverage now, I'd tried to dismiss it. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe Martha had confused Elaine with another patient. But the way Martha had shut down, the way she'd suddenly remembered privacy protocols after months of casual conversation, she hadn't confused. She'd been correcting a mistake. I'd gone home and pulled out my files. Years of medical invoices, neatly organized by date. I'd never really studied them before. Just confirmed the amount, written the check, filed the receipt. Now I looked closer. At the dates, the services, the patterns, and something didn't align. Small discrepancies I'd never noticed because I'd been too busy paying to actually analyze. But I noticed now, and once I'd started looking, I couldn't stop. That night, I said nothing to Elaine. Didn't call, didn't text. Just sat at my kitchen table surrounded by years of medical documentation, trying to understand what I was seeing. The bills had never decreased. That was the first thing I noticed. Even as treatment supposedly progressed, costs stayed consistent, sometimes increased. Normal medical treatment follows a pattern. Acute intervention, followed by maintenance, ideally trending toward improvement or at least stabilization with reduced costs. These bills showed such pattern. Just steady, expensive consistency. I found duplicate charges. Services billed twice, months apart for the same procedure code. I found unfamiliar line items. Administrative fees and consultation costs that seemed vague even for medical billing. Nothing was obviously fraudulent. Everything had proper codes, proper documentation. But taken together, it felt managed, carefully maintained at a level just below my threshold for questioning. I'd been paying for years without asking questions because questions felt like accusations, like doubting someone who was suffering. But sitting there at 2 a.m, surrounded by papers that told a story I'd been too trusting to read, I realized something terrible. I didn't know if Elaine was sick anymore. I just knew she was expensive, and I'd never asked the difference. The next morning I drove to work on autopilot, my mind still processing what I'd seen in those files. Paul had called around lunchtime. "You okay? You seem off." "Just tired." "Elaine again?" I'd hesitated. "Maybe. I don't know yet." "What does that mean?" "It means I think I've been missing something. For a long time." Paul had been quiet. Then, "You want to talk about it?" "Not yet. I need to be sure first." "Sure about what?" "About whether I've been helping someone who needed it or funding someone who just learned I'd never say no." The words had tasted bitter, disloyal, but also finally true. "If you need anything," Paul had said carefully, "I'm here." "I know. Thanks." I'd hung up and stared at my desk, at the framed photo I'd never bothered to remove. Me and Elaine from years ago, smiling at some event I couldn't remember. Back when we'd still looked at each other with something other than obligation. When had that changed? When had we become this arrangement where I paid and she accepted, and neither of us questioned whether it should continue? I didn't know, but I was finally ready to find out. I noticed things I'd trained myself not to see. The way Elaine's updates were always urgent enough to justify immediate payment, but never specific enough to allow follow-up questions. The way she'd go silent for weeks between invoices, then reappear only when new bills arrived. The way her gratitude felt performative, required rather than genuine. I'd been complicit in this. I'd made it easy for her to use me by never demanding transparency. Never asking for medical records or progress reports, or any accountability beyond, "I need help and thank you." I'd wanted to be needed so badly that I'd ignored every sign that my help had become her income source. And now, sitting with that realization, I felt something I'd been avoiding for 6 years. Anger. Not the loud kind, not explosive or dramatic, Just quiet, steady anger at being used, at being seen as useful rather than human, at spending years maintaining someone else's life while putting my own on hold. The anger didn't make me feel better. It just made me feel awake, like I'd been sleepwalking through my own exploitation and finally, painfully, opened my eyes. I didn't know yet what I'd do with this awareness, but I knew I couldn't unknow it. I called the clinic the next day, telling myself I just needed clarification. A simple misunderstanding I could resolve with one conversation. I'd asked for billing, been transferred to Martha's extension. Riverside Medical, this is Martha. Hi Martha, it's Harry Wood. I'm calling about Elaine's account. There might be a clerical error. Oh, her voice had shifted to professional caution. What kind of error? I'm seeing duplicate charges for services from March and again in July. Same procedure codes. Typing sounds. A long pause. Mr. Wood, those charges are correct. They're for separate visits. For the same procedure? More typing. The silence had stretched uncomfortably. Mr. Wood, I really should have Mrs. Wood contact us directly about billing questions. Privacy regulations. I'm the one paying the bills, Martha. I understand, but is Elaine's condition stabilized? The question had come out sharper than I'd intended. Martha had gone very quiet. I can't discuss patient medical status without authorization. You mentioned an employer plan last week. Is Elaine working? Mr. Wood. Just yes or no. Is she employed? The silence lasted too long, long enough to be an answer. When Martha finally spoke, her voice was careful, almost apologetic. You should discuss this with Mrs. Wood directly. She'd hung up shortly after. I'd sat holding the phone, my heart pounding. The silence had told me everything. I called back an hour later. Different approach, calmer voice. Martha, I apologize for earlier. I shouldn't have pushed. It's all right, Mr. Wood. She'd sounded relieved. These things can be frustrating. I just want to understand what I'm paying for. Can you help me with that? Even generally? She'd hesitated. Then, quietly, Mr. Wood, how long have you been covering these bills? 6 years. 6 years, she'd repeated, something sad in her voice. And Mrs. Wood's primary condition, the one from your marriage, when was she cleared? Cleared, past tense. I don't know, I'd admitted. She doesn't talk about it in those terms. Mr. Wood. Martha had paused, clearly wrestling with something. I can't give you specifics, but I can tell you that many of the recent charges on this account they're not treatment for chronic illness. What are they for? Wellness programs, elective consultations. Some are administrative fees for payment plans Mrs. Wood arranged separately. My hands had started shaking. Payment plans? For what? Services we provide that her current insurance doesn't cover. Services you've been supplementing. Her current insurance being the employer plan. Silence. Yes, Martha had finally said. I'm sorry, Mr. Wood. I thought you knew. How long? How long what? How long has she had employer coverage? I really can't. Please. Martha had sighed. According to our records, about 3 years. 3 years. 3 years of employer benefits while I'd been paying for medical necessities she couldn't afford. Thank you, I'd managed, for your honesty. I'd hung up before she could respond. I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot, unable to drive, unable to process what I'd just learned. 3 years. For 3 years, Elaine had had stable employment with health insurance while I'd been covering bills she'd framed as survival necessities. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to her contact. My thumb hovered over the call button. What would I even say? How do you confront someone who'd quietly reframed need into convenience? Who'd let you sacrifice for years beyond when sacrifice was necessary? I didn't call. Instead, I opened the folder of her thank you messages. Hundreds of them. I couldn't do this without you. Except she could. She had been. For years. She'd just never told me because telling me would mean losing a funding source she'd grown comfortable exploiting. I wasn't helping someone survive. I was subsidizing someone who'd learned that my guilt was more profitable than honesty. The realization settled over me like cold water. Clarifying. Irreversible. I'd spent 6 years being useful, being needed, being the person who'd never abandon her. And she'd spent 6 years letting me believe that's who I needed to be. While building a separate life I wasn't part of, a life stable enough that my help was optional but appreciated. I understood finally. Elaine hadn't needed saving. She'd needed funding. There was a difference I'd been too guilty to see. Saving someone means helping them survive crisis, helping them build stability, helping them reach a point where they don't need you anymore. Funding someone means becoming a resource they tap indefinitely. A source that doesn't dry up because you've never thought to turn it off. I'd been funding Elaine's comfort while she'd built security I'd known nothing about. The employer plan meant steady income, benefits, stability she'd achieved while still accepting my checks every month. Many of the charges weren't even medical anymore, Martha had said. Wellness programs, elective consultations, administrative fees for services insurance didn't cover. Luxuries, essentially. Paid for by someone who'd been led to believe they were necessities. I pulled out my bank statements, calculated what I'd paid over 6 years. The number made my stomach turn. Enough for a down payment on a house, enough to completely restart my life. Enough to have built something instead of just maintaining someone else's comfort. And Elaine had let me, month after month, year after year, while building her own security in silence, not because she was desperate, because I'd never asked her to stop. I drove home in a daze, parked in my designated spot at the modest apartment complex I'd never left because I'd convinced myself I couldn't afford better. I'd made dinner, pasta, the cheap kind, and eaten it standing at the counter, too restless to sit. My phone had buzzed. Elaine. Just got notice of another specialist appointment next month. They're estimating $1,200 out of pocket. I'm so sorry, Harry, I know it's a lot. I'd stared at the message for a long time. At the familiar phrasing, the apologetic tone, the request embedded in the sorry. 3 years. She'd had stable employment for 3 years, and still she sent these messages. Still she framed her life as precarious. Still she positioned me as her only option. I'd typed and deleted responses for 10 minutes, finally settled on "we need to talk." The 3 dots appeared immediately, disappeared. Appeared again. Is everything okay? No, I'd wanted to type. Nothing's okay. Nothing's been okay for years. I've just been too afraid to admit it. Instead, can we meet? Of course. When? Tomorrow. Coffee. Harry, you're scaring me. What's this about? I turned off my phone without answering. Let her wonder. Let her feel uncertainty for once. I was done being the reliable one. I didn't meet Elaine for coffee. I'd planned to, had the conversation mapped out. Questions I needed answered, boundaries I needed to establish. But sitting in my car outside the cafe, I'd realized something. Confrontation would just give her another opportunity to explain, to reframe, to make me feel guilty for questioning her. And I was done being managed, so I texted instead, "I'm not paying anymore." 4 words, simple, final. Her response came immediately. What? Why? What happened? I'd turned off my phone. For the first time in 6 years, I'd chosen myself. Chosen silence over explanation. Chosen withdrawal over confrontation. No dramatic speech, no accusations, no demand for apology or repayment. Just no. No more checks. No more emergency texts. No more being the person she could count on to never question, never refuse, never prioritize himself. I'd gone home, pulled out every medical invoice, every receipt, every record of payment, put them all in a box, not for legal action, not for vindication. Just to close the chapter. To physically remove the evidence of my exploitation from my living space. The box went in the back of my closet, out of sight. A sealed record of everything I'd given and would never get back. But also, everything I'd stopped giving. Elaine's calls turned frantic, then angry, then accusing. The first few I'd let go to voicemail. "Harry, please call me back. I don't understand what's happening." Then, "This is incredibly unfair. You can't just abandon me without explanation." Then, after everything I've been through, after everything we went through together, "This is how you treat someone who needed you?" I'd listened to each message once, deleted them without responding. Paul had asked if I was okay. "Better than I've been in years," I'd told him honestly. What changed? I stopped believing I owed someone my life just because they'd learned to ask for it. Elaine's final message had come 2 weeks after I'd stopped paying. "I can't believe you're doing this. I thought you were different. I thought you cared." Her voice had been cold, angry in a way I'd never heard during our marriage or after. Not hurt, not confused, just angry that a resource had dried up. And in that anger, I'd heard the truth. She'd cared about what I could provide, not who I was. She'd called me different, special, the one person she could count on, because I'd been the one person who'd never required her to be honest. I deleted the message. blocked her number. The silence that followed felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. For the first time since the divorce, I chose myself. And the silence felt like freedom. No more monitoring my phone for emergency texts. No more structuring my budget around someone else's needs. No more sacrificing my present for someone else's comfort. I'd moved 3 months later. Not far. Just to a better apartment. 2 bedrooms, better light. A place that felt like a home instead of a waiting room. I'd gone on a date with someone from work. Not Maggie. She'd moved to another city, but someone new. Someone who didn't know about my history of self-erasure. It hadn't turned into anything serious, but it had reminded me what it felt like to be chosen, to be wanted for who I was rather than what I could provide. Paul had taken me out for my birthday, the first one I'd celebrated in years. "You look different," he'd said. "Different how?" "Lighter, like you put down something heavy." He was right. I had. I'd put down the weight of believing my value came from my usefulness, that love meant endless sacrifice, that walking away from exploitation was the same as abandonment. Elaine had taught me what I didn't want, a relationship built on need, disguised as connection. On guilt wielded as obligation, on silence maintained through fear of seeming cruel. And in walking away from that, I'd learned what I did want, to be someone's choice, not someone's convenience. The freedom was quiet, unremarkable to anyone watching, just a man living his life. But to me, it was everything. I'd chosen myself, finally, completely. And for the first time in 6 years, that felt like enough.